Hey everyone, let's jump right in. Today's explainer is a fascinating one. We're unpacking a pretty massive, kind of complex economic and tax blueprint from former Senator Gerard Rennick. Now, whether you lean left, right, or somewhere smack in the middle, getting into the nuts and bolts of these economic proposals is absolutely crucial if we want to understand where our financial systems could be heading. So let's deconstruct his arguments step by step.
Here's our roadmap for today. We've got 6 key pillars to hit, starting with the current political shifts, rethinking negative gearing, and the battle of taxing labor versus capital. Then we'll dive into the velocity of money, infrastructure and debt, and wrap up with exactly how this whole thing gets funded.
All right, starting off with part 1, political shifts and momentum.
So, to really get this policy, we first need to understand the political landscape Rennick is looking at. He makes a pretty blunt observation here. He says the traditional conservative brands, the liberals and the nationals, are fundamentally damaged. From his viewpoint, they're kind of stuck in a rut. But on the flip side, he notes that one nation has picked up some serious political momentum. In fact, Rennick suggests that if things keep going this way, one nation could actually dominate the major conservative parties at the next election. That would potentially give them the whip hand in future policy negotiations. And that shift, that's exactly why alternative economic blueprints like his are suddenly a big part of the national conversation.
Okay, with that political context in mind, let's get into the actual mechanics. Section 2, rethinking negative gearing. Rennick actually breaks down the exact math to critique how the current system works. He argues the usual way we handle negative gearing is completely counterproductive. Think about it like this. If you're on the top tax rate, you spend $1 just to get 47 cents back in tax. As he points out, the net result there is you are literally 53 cents worse off. So his argument is this. If we want to naturally cool down negative gearing, attacking it directly isn't the way to go. Instead, you lower the overall income tax rate. If that tax rate drops to, say, 30 or 25 cents, well, spending $1 just to get 25 cents back suddenly becomes a whole lot less appealing for an investor, right?
Building on that, Rennick has a broader critique of the current Labor government's approach. Interestingly, he doesn't actually mind the idea of removing capital gains tax discounts to level the playing field. What he really objects to is how that extra tax revenue is spent. Instead of pouring it into more government spending, he argues it should go straight into permanent income tax cuts. He's incredibly critical of temporary tax offsets. Why? Because, people tend to just blow a temporary lump sum over a weekend. But permanent cuts, those let families actually sit down and budget. Plus, he points out that temporary offsets get completely chewed up by inflation and bracket creep almost immediately. So for him, making a permanent lift to the tax-free threshold is just absolutely essential.
And that logic leads us right into our third section, where we zoom out to his broader philosophy. Section 3, taxing labor versus capital.
Now, to really grasp where he's coming from here, you gotta look at his background. Rennick actually holds a master's of tax law and has spent his career engaged in tax arbitrage, which is essentially finding perfectly legal ways to lower tax liabilities. Drawing from that deep, hands-on experience, he argues our current Australian tax system is fundamentally flawed. Why? Because it rewards passive investment way more than active work. And he sees this as a massive, massive barrier to national productivity.
This comparison really hits the nail on the head when it comes to the inequality he's highlighting. On one side, you've got income derived from labor. We're talking about the 14 million Australians out there grinding every single day. Picture a low-income earner commuting an hour each way from Western Sydney, pulling in maybe $70,000 or $80,000 a year. Then, on the flip side, you have income derived from capital gains, like passive property appreciation, which is being driven up by things like high immigration. Rennick argues it is just profoundly unfair that the hardworking commuter pays twice the tax rate of someone making the exact same amount of money just by sitting on a passive asset. He wants to level that playing field, once and for all.
So, what happens to the economy if we actually slash those income taxes? Well, that brings us to Section 4, the velocity of money.
I honestly love how he visualizes this macroeconomic theory. Rennick uses this brilliant bicycle metaphor to explain how heavy taxation restricts the economy. He says, it's a bit like riding a push bike. If the bike's in too high gear, you can't pedal. It's so true, right? He argues that a heavy tax burden acts exactly like that high gear, just freezing up economic movement. But if you lower the income tax rate, you're effectively dropping the bike into a lower gear, making it so much easier for the average citizen to just start pedaling again.
Now, in the economics world, that pedaling is what we call the velocity of money. And here is where Rennick points out a massive flaw in Treasury modeling. He says the Treasury basically assumes that if you give a low-income earner a $1,000 tax cut, poof, that money is just lost to the government forever. But Rennick counters that. He says, look, during times of 4 to 5% inflation, a low-income earner isn't going to hoard that cash. No way. They are going to spend it immediately. And when they do, that spending cycles right back into the economy over the next 12 months. Ironically, it ends up right back in the government's pockets through GST, company tax, and payroll tax.
Let's pivot away from individual taxes for a second and look at the big picture. Section 5, Infrastructure and State Debt.
Okay, the crucial context here is that national debt is projected to blow past $1 trillion. $1 trillion! Rennick views this as a huge threat to intergenerational fairness, arguing we simply can't leave our kids to foot that massive bill. To tackle this, he proposes setting up an infrastructure bank. But the goal isn't just to build random things for the sake of it. The strategy is to build heavy, revenue-generating assets. We're talking ports, dams, and power stations. Because those assets produce recurring revenue for the state, which then permanently funds the recurring everyday costs of essential services, like schools and hospitals.
Now, if you're sitting there wondering, does a state-driven infrastructure model actually work in the real world? Rennick points straight to the history of his home state, Queensland. First off, Queensland managed to turn its entire economy around using freight charges and royalties from coal in the Bowen Basin. Then, economic figures like Leo Hilscher stepped in and mandated that bauxite couldn't just be shipped out raw, it had to go to Gladstone to be value-added into alumina first. That simple move kept a massive amount of profit right inside the state treasury. And thanks to those huge recurring infrastructure revenues, Queensland became the only state to fully fund its defined benefit scheme for teachers, nurses, and police. For Rennick, this historical timeline is absolute concrete proof that his strategy works.
So all of this, the tax cuts, the infrastructure, leveling the playing field, it's a massive overhaul. But the million-dollar question is, how on earth is it paid for? And that brings us to our final chapter, Section 6, Funding the Economic Proposal.
Let's look at the primary objective of this whole blueprint. Rennick wants to hike the tax-free threshold up to a massive $45,000. Think about that for a second. That means the first 45 grand a hardworking Australian makes would be completely untouched by the tax office.
But we've got to immediately contrast that incredible benefit with the cost. And the cost is staggering. Lifting the threshold that high would rip a $45 billion hole straight through the national budget. It's literally an astronomical figure. So let's look at the ledger and see exactly how he balances the books here. To cover that $45 billion price tag, Rennick proposes entirely scrapping government subsidies for renewables. On top of that, he wants to means test the defined benefit pension schemes for retired bureaucrats in Canberra. By trading away those specific subsidies and pensions, and by adjusting the Treasury modeling to factor in that velocity of money we talked about earlier, he argues that the $45 billion is actually easily covered.
Which brings us to the ultimate question we really have to ask ourselves today. Would trading away renewable subsidies and public pensions to fund a massive $45,000 tax-free threshold actually stabilize the economy and reward workers? Or would it just create entirely new vulnerabilities in the system? It's a genuinely fascinating macroeconomic trade-off, and honestly, it's exactly the kind of structural debate we need to be having right now. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this blueprint today. Keep questioning the numbers, and I'll see you in the next explainer.